About a week ago, I put together a what you might call an extended montage of VYou clips. VYou was a interesting social media platform in which people would record up to 2-minute clips of them, usually from their webcams. I think some people did it a little bit more sophisticated. And you would respond to questions or comments from other VYousers. And eventually it got to be quite large. There were a lot of people doing it, but it ended up folding. So they sent all of us VYousers all of our footage if we asked for it. And I've been wading through the stuff and organizing it. So this is another one of those 10 VYou clips. These are all focused on ethics and you might say on the sort of big picture general issue type of stuff. I'm going to be shooting, I've got enough footage for a number of other ones on ethics, and I'll be shooting those, or rather editing those together with a little intro clip like this over the next couple weeks. So if you enjoy this sort of thing, here you go. Okay, so another question from one of my ethics class students, and this is one that comes up every single semester in every class, sometimes throughout the entire semester, because it's a really big worry that people have, particularly in our culture, where it seems like moral norms are clearly not shared across the board, and yet we all use moral vocabulary. So it seems like you can't get away from moral judgments altogether. But who gets to decide, right? So my question is, who is the one to determine what is truly right or wrong? And I'd like to point out just a couple things with that. The first thing is, the really simple answer to that is you are. By virtue of being a human being, you make moral judgments. You can't avoid making moral judgments. And it's really interesting, because if you look at moral theories all across the board, almost all of them agree on at least this thing: you have to judge something as being right and something as being wrong, or good or bad. Aristotle actually says that this is part of our human nature, that it's even part of our language. It's how we're different from the animals, that we recognize good, bad, right, wrong, just, unjust, and the other animals don't. They only recognize painful, pleasurable, and useful or harmful. The other thing that I'd like to point out is, if you notice how this question is phrased, who is the one to determine what is truly right or wrong? And that truly right there, that's very important, because what it indicates is that one could be mistaken about this, right? So in making a moral judgment, one is not necessarily saying, I know I'm completely correct about this, I couldn't possibly be wrong, nobody could convince me that there's some better way of looking at things. But you shouldn't be afraid to make moral judgments. There you go. So this is actually a follow-up question. How can moral philosophy be objectively applicable or satisfying? Language is a little bit confused there. I'm not quite sure if I know exactly what the person has in mind, but I'm guessing by objectively applicable, what they mean is that I can trust it, that other people can trust it, that it could actually apply across the board. That's one of those sort of questions that we address early on in classes about moral philosophy. If you don't think that there are any moral norms that we can reason out that apply to people in general or across the board, well, you can't do moral philosophy. Not going to find a lot of philosophers who actually hold that view. You won't actually find a lot of criminals who hold that view. I can tell you, having worked in a maximum security prison, taught there for years and years. Moral philosophy, when we say that it's objective, we don't mean that everybody agrees or that everybody recognizes it. That's an interesting feature of moral discourse and moral theory, since it applies to right and wrong and applies to human beings who are caught in these webs of vulnerability and have to develop and quite often have mistaken viewpoints. You're not going to get everybody to agree. And so if that's what you mean by objective, you need to find another field, like, say, physics, right? Because moral norms are not of that sort. Satisfying, I find the study of moral systems inherently satisfying, but that's because I enjoy the life of the mind. I think a lot of it is a matter of practice, sort of like the athlete enjoys physical activity and gamesmanship because they've done it and they're good at it. Same thing if you work in the life of the mind. The longer you do it, the more you enjoy it if you're actually working with the right things. So I'm finally catching up on my VYou questions, and this is a really interesting one for a couple of reasons. Is the notion of being right or wrong just a delusion that we create in our own minds, followed up by do such things hinder or warp the human psyche? So let me say yes and no. Being right or wrong in the sense of, like being completely right, being completely wrong, or actions being right or wrong, or being right or wrong about particular beliefs, or holding certain values. Is the notion of being right or wrong just a delusion that we create in our own minds? No. As a matter of fact, it's a basic experience of human life, and moral life is inextricably connected with that. Even to say that these things hinder or warp the human psyche, you're making value judgments. You're making judgments about what's good and bad, right and wrong. Well, our understanding of what's right or wrong and the degree of adequacy to which we understand those things, whether we understand them in very simplistic ways or whether we understand them in more complex ways, because reality is quite complex. Those could hinder or warp the human psyche. Aristotle and Plato talk about this, and so does Epictetus and a lot of ancient philosophers. If you have mistaken views about human nature, or about what the good is, or how to order different goods in your life, or how you ought to be treating people, and you could be getting these through observation and then not thinking things through carefully, or your own emotions, your passions could steer you in the wrong direction. You could be getting these from your culture or society. There's a lot of different places that these could come from. These can hinder or warp the human psyche, both in its development, and in how it comes about, and how it gets better or gets worse over time, and also in the moment-to-moment times when we have to make decisions that affect our character, decisions that affect who we're going to become, also affecting our relationships, which is a large part of who we are. So, for instance, if you have the view that other people are merely there to be exploited for your own ends, and that they don't have any value in themselves except insofar as they contribute to your own desires being satisfied or your own well-being, and you act on that, which you will do if you have that view, you're going to hinder your development. You're going to set it back. You're going to warp your psyche, and eventually you will have a very difficult time, even if you wanted to change that, no longer seeing things that way. Should we be teaching ethics in K through 12, and should it be mandatory in higher ed? Yes to both. And let's make a distinction here between teaching ethics in the sense of endorsing a particular ethical approach or ethical theory, and teaching about ethical theories or ethical approaches, and doing it comparatively, and working out which one might be better or more applicable in a particular situation for students. Both of those ought to be done K through 12. Both of those ought to be done in higher ed. They're not. And part of it is, I think, because we have this discomfort in our society about teaching about right and wrong, and people, how do they get good at that? Well, you actually have to have arguments about it, and you have to have discussions, and you can't just sort of pull back and say, oh, no, we can't talk about that, that's the realm of morality. You get better at it by, like anything else, by practice, by engaging, by thinking about it. I think we ought to be doing that. I think that we philosophy professors, who are not the only people who can teach ethics, but we're the ones who actually have a special focus on it. We ought to be teaching the K through 12 teachers how to do it well. I think that in better schools, should it be mandatory for higher ed? Better schools it is. And you don't just do it with one course. Actually, in better schools, you have a real emphasis on it, because it's not something that you can just teach and then you're done with and forget about. It's got to be infused through the curriculum. And again, I think philosophers ought to be taking the lead on that, although I don't see them doing it. I did actually here at FSU by helping to form the Ethics in Business Education project. And the whole goal was to not go into business classes and teach business ethics, but for us philosophers to help the business professionals, the business educators, raise their levels of competence and confidence in teaching students, so they could see that this is something worth taking seriously. And I think that's important. Yes, I think ethics should be taught in school, because one way or the other you're going to do it, so you may as well do it thoughtfully and do it coherently and do it well. I like the way in which you framed this question, because this could actually be like this is something I would spend a whole class period on if I was in an ethics class, just unpacking all the different assumptions and sort of permutations on it. Because we operate on a personal level in regards to moral value judgments, do you feel ethics should be taught in school? And I would say yes, precisely because we operate on a personal level in regards to moral value judgments, for a couple different reasons. One is we grow as ethical beings, that is, we make moral progress, we develop. And this is part of the human, this is part of the nature of human beings and society. We do that in part through moving from lower stages to higher and higher stages of ethical development, of having better moral theories. Now, they don't have to be, like explicitly framed as theories, but they can be embodied in the way in which you live. And because we operate on personal levels, that means that different people are going to be at different levels. So some people are at a very low level and just respond to reward punishment. They're purely selfish. They don't take account of how their behaviors affect others. And then once you start to take account of that, you can start thinking of different reasons why you care about how it affects others. Do you care because it's a matter of principle? Do you care because you're getting something out of it? Do you care just because you want warm fuzzies from people thinking you're a nice person? Those are all different. Those are different moral positions, and they represent different moral theories. So yeah, this is a great question, actually. Okay, so this is a follow-up to my response to the question about whether ethics should be taught in K through 12 and in college, where I said yes, it should. Okay, so if you teach ethics in school, isn't that pushing your morality on students? Real issue there. Yeah, I'm definitely attuned to that issue. And you have to be careful to put things in place to make sure that it isn't just going to be simply imposing one conception of right and wrong onto students, which actually is not even very productive from the standpoint of teaching ethics and moral development, which requires that there actually be some discussion and debate and even conflict and sometimes even making mistakes in order for there to be progress. I think there is a real danger of once you start deliberately talking about ethics in school, about pushing one thing or another. I think there's also, it's quite clear that if you don't do ethics in school, you are still doing ethics. You're just doing a very bad one. You're doing one that's kind of careless, haphazard, thrown together, and the students are getting ideas about right and wrong from somewhere, whether you want them to or not. So, again, I would make a distinction between teaching a particular scheme of ethics, which, at a basic level, yeah, we do have to do that. Tell the students don't hit each other. That's an ethical doctrine, right? But also teaching them about various standpoints and theories and their weaknesses, their strengths, how they can speak to each other. I think that's really important because without that, the students they don't think about it, they don't engage. And part of what we're looking for is not people who have the right wrong answer for every single thing, but people who have a good idea about how to proceed to generate at least something like a right answer when they're posed with difficult situations. I think we can do that in school. Okay, so this is a deep entangled set of questions here that I'm not going to be able to fully address within 2 minutes. So I finally have brought home to me the fact that I need to do what some other VYousers have done and start recording discussions and answers to some of these questions on my YouTube channel. And I'm going to do that with this one about objectivity and teaching ethics and pushing morality. So let me just give a few broad outlines and a few partial answers. Isn't philosophy objective and logical? Yes and no. To begin with, when we use that term logical, that's not something that all philosophers actually agree on. If we look at the history of philosophy, there's formal logic, and that's really basic stuff, but that gets you nowhere. There's nothing substantive to that. As soon as we start getting into substantive logics, then things start getting a lot more controversial, and the subject starts becoming involved, and it's no longer just as objective. Now, some people reject that whole notion of anything beyond a formal logic being a logic, but again, other philosophers haven't. Isn't philosophy objective? It aims at objectivity, but objectivity is not by itself the most important thing in the world. There's actually whole schools of philosophy that stress the importance of subjectivity. What Paul Ricoeur has called good subjectivity. Existentialism, for example, begins from our subjective standpoint and says that's very important. I don't think a prof can push his or her morality onto students, otherwise they're not teaching. You've got a couple different things mixed up there. Professors do push their morality on the students, and sometimes they are teaching. Sometimes that can be an integral part. So I'm going to leave it off there. So I take it you sending me to Tony's Flood site wasn't actually because you actually are interested in Tony Flood, but because you want me to react to Clifford's Ethics of Belief. His famous essay, which happens to be housed there, but it happens to be housed at like 1,000 other sites. So at first I was going on Flood's site, which I thank you for showing me. I've heard the guy's name, and something tells me that I've actually run across him at a conference, but I've never actually looked at his site. It turns out that he and I share quite a few interests and heroes in common, including Norris Clark, great Thomist personalist philosopher, Eric Vigeland, Ernst Cassirer, and Lord Acton. He's also, it seems to be quite infatuated with some process theologians who I have no interest in whatsoever, and with Lonergan, who I have a hard time taking very seriously. But be that as it may. Okay, so you're asking me about Clifford's Ethics of Belief. I think Clifford's wrong. I think that he is wrong in an interesting way. He's wrong on some points. He's wrong in the emphasis. And I buy William James's critique of Clifford, that we would not only never get anything done if we held rigorously to his beliefs, to his views on things, but that he cannot even take account of his own ethics of belief according to his ethics of belief, which is a problem of consistency. But even more, that if you don't actually extend yourself and make the experiment and try things out, you will never actually have any grounds for believing many things that you actually would later on have good grounds for believing if you extended yourself and risked. And okay, so interesting. I should actually do a longer thing about this, but I'll do that. I think that I might do some writing, maybe on Virtue Ethics Digest about this, or maybe in one of my Dr. Sadler Chalk and Talks talking about this, because this is a really important question. When do we have the opportunity to practice virtue ethics in our daily lives? So let's think about what it means to practice this sort of thing. We become virtuous by doing actions that are in accordance with virtue. We don't yet have virtue at that point, but we're acting the way that a virtuous person does, and we're approaching things as best we can in the way that a virtuous person does. We're using them as the model, and we're trying to measure up to them, you might say. So I think in our ordinary daily lives as plain persons, to use McIntyre's phrase, I would say the greatest opportunities that we have are moments of, one, temptation, and then two, annoyance. And maybe this is going too much from my own personal experience, but if you think about what the virtues are, they're habits that reflect patterns of choice that eventually become part of our personality, part of our character. So are vices. And virtues sort of incline us to make the right decisions, to go the right ways, to choose the right action at the right time, to feel the way that we ought to, towards the things that we ought to. So when does this come up the most often? When is it needed the most often? When we're tempted by something that we know, at least on some level, we probably shouldn't pursue, but we feel that desire, we feel the temptation for it. And I would say annoyance too, because some of the virtues are actually concerned with things like patience, control over anger, keeping our impulses under control. And I think that those are situations like that. So, a lot more to say about this.